What truly feeds us? What do we do when there is more need than we can satisfy? Burnout is so common. Stories of a miraculous multiplication of bread address these kinds of questions, but not just externally, although that is often the most immediate need. Spiritually, the most fundamental need for us as human beings is how we relate to our awareness that we are finite, that we are limited, that we, in the language of the Bible and other sacred texts, are poor. We cannot create something out of nothing. And how we relate to this awareness has a tremendous impact also on whether we eradicate poverty actually externally or perpetuate it. Greetings and welcome to this 12th and final lecture this spring semester 2022 on a revolutionary new way of reading the Bible by Eugen Drewermann, an internationally best-selling author of more than 100 books. Drewermann uses insights from psychology, biblical studies, philosophy, poetry, and the sciences to help us read these stories as stories of our own lives and not just as stories from the distant past. If this is your first time, you can find my previous lectures in a playlist on this channel. There are also other videos, including an event with Drewermann and the Dalai Lama in English, where they both talked together, and Drewermann gave a lecture that he then discussed with the Dalai Lama in Zurich at the ETH. Today, we will look at two stories in the Gospel of Mark that tell of a miraculous multiplication of bread to satisfy the true need that is there, the true hunger of our lives. They are known widely as the feeding of the 5,000 or the feeding of the 4,000. And historical and literary research shows that these two texts are basically duplicates. As you're listening, I invite you to keep in mind the questions: what feeds me? What feeds us? And how do we nourish each other? Is it by asserting what we have? Or is it by acknowledging our vulnerability, what we do not have, our needs as well? As I said in the interpretation of the Stilling of the Storm stories, stories like these are not magical stories. Historical research shows that they were not meant as external miracle stories. They weren't meant in the Hollywood movie style, think Bruce Almighty, of all of a sudden a physical mountain of bread appearing out of 5 bread. These stories were partly written down for what we might call today propaganda stories, for propaganda purposes, to assert that Jesus, whom the early Christians believed in, was bigger and did bigger miracles than earlier prophets in Israel or than so-called miracle workers in the so-called pagan world. The early church looked at these similar stories of miraculous feeding in the Hebrew scriptures, which many Christians call the Old Testament, particularly the stories of the prophets Elijah and Elisha in the biblical books of Kings. Stories like these were therefore seen not as the stories here in the Gospels were therefore not seen as physical miracle stories or about physical miracles, but basically as stories to make a point. You could call them like miracles of preaching. There's a complicated German word for that called, it comes from the Greek actually, kerygma, and that basically is about preaching. It's about getting the message out, and that these stories were stories to basically make a point through preaching, namely to assert the greatness of Jesus. Now, such results of historical study have led generations of preachers to preach these stories like in a similar way to do the same thing, namely to use these stories as propaganda stories to extol the greatness of Jesus and of the church, of course. But what gets lost in that focus is the focus on the need, on the suffering, feeling oneself really into the stories as human stories. The suffering, the need of the people portrayed in these stories, and the compassion that is so central to the miracle in these stories, and the risk of really looking at one's poverty, one's need. So Drewermann points out that when we take a closer look at these stories, we actually do not see Jesus playing the big honcho, but instead doing the exact opposite. That namely, Jesus is here actually very human, like we ourselves. And here, Drewermann argues, a psychological and existential reading is necessary to understand that these stories actually tell us about a very different miracle that each of us can and so often does experience. So let us go into the first story as interpreted by Drewermann. It is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 35 through 44. And Drewermann interpreted it in this commentary here on the Gospel of Mark. It's in German, and these lectures are part of the effort to actually translate these texts, this book, and I'm in the process of translating this book, and the plan is that over the next couple of years, one of these books will appear in English. So here's the text, beginning with verse 35 in chapter 6 of the Gospel of Mark. And I have translated Drewermann's translation that he did directly from the Greek. And I've also consulted the Greek as I was doing the English translation. So, and when it was already late, his disciples came to him and said, "The place is deserted, and the hour is already late. Dismiss them, meaning the people, so that once they have gone to the surrounding countryside and villages, they might buy something to eat for themselves. But he, Jesus, answered them, "You give them to eat." Then they tell him, "We're supposed to go and buy bread for 200 denarii and give them to eat?" But he says to them, "How many loaves of bread do you have? Go look." They find out and say, 5, and 2 fish. Then he instructs all of them to sit down together in festive groups on the green lawn. And they lay down group, by hundreds, by 50s. Then he took the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, gave thanks, broke the loaves of bread in 2, and gave them to his disciples to present them to the people. And he also divided the 2 fish among them. And that way, all ate and were satisfied. And they still picked up 12 baskets full of broken pieces, and also from the fish. And those who had eaten the loaves of bread were 5,000 men. And here is Drewermann's interpretation of this first story. Often we imagine the miracles of Jesus such that Jesus, knowing his divinity and power, toured the towns and villages of Galilee and lavished his own overflowing greatness to heal, or at least to ameliorate, human misery and human suffering. Some passages, especially in the Gospel of Mark, however, portray Jesus differently, in a certain way more human, in a certain way more divine. He who himself said, "Blessed are the poor before God," must have had a deep sense for human powerlessness and frailty. He based his own life on the belief that God would be able to close the abyss of our human misery, enriching us in our poverty, elevating us amidst our nothingness. For example, once a rich young man came to him and asked, "Good master, what must I do to enter the kingdom or the realm of heaven?" According to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus answered, "Why do you call me good? Only one is good, the one who is in heaven." That is how much Jesus must have forbidden himself any grandstanding and any craving for admiration. His greatness lay in casting as little shadow as possible with his own figure between the sun and people. His greatness, his divinity, lay in becoming transparent towards the light. There's no other way to understand this story of the miraculous multiplication of bread. The story begins with a severe shock to Jesus. John the Baptist, his teacher who baptized him at the Jordan River, was eliminated due to intrigues at the royal court. That's the story that happened right before this story. Jesus himself had said about him in Matthew 11:11, among those born of a woman on earth, no one is greater than he. For John spoke as the prophets who had appeared during the time of the kings, powerfully, clearly, and unambiguously. The horror about the infamous murder of this man must have been so great for Jesus that Matthew reports that at this news, he decided to seek solitude, as if he needed to re-examine his relationship to people and to revise it if necessary. But people hear of his whereabouts and do not cease to surround and beset him. Perhaps it is one of the decisive experiences of Jesus that it is not possible to think low of people, not even in view of the malice they're capable of at any given time, and that no right exists to despise them, even in view of all the despicable things they do again and again. Jesus is moved by pity when he sees people gathering around him. And thus he must find words beyond the death of John the Baptist. For as great as the figure of the forerunner was and is, as wrong was and is it perhaps to address humans only in terms of their moral capacity, as if they could simply be good whenever they wanted to be. Perhaps it is infinitely more correct to see people compassionately and to note that those who create the most suffering are usually the ones who have themselves suffered the most. And those who cause the most destruction are those who have been destroyed the most. In such a vision of compassion, Jesus must have heard the words of Isaiah in a completely new way. Comfort, comfort my people. Speak only kindly to the heart of Jerusalem. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 2. Jesus must have learned that every word that demands, commands, and admonishes is wrong, and that the only thing that matters is to heal the sickness of people through the gesture of laying on of hands and the kindness of understanding. It was on the evening of this eventful day that the disciples asked Jesus to send people away. There was certainly a touch of care and responsibility in this request, but it also betrayed a thinking close to the level-headed rule of conduct of let each person be closest to themselves. This rule fully corresponds to the motto of our everyday, seemingly quite natural reason. It thus cuts through a principle when Jesus commands the disciple not to dismiss the people. He, who himself has become aware that there's no escape from people in view of their misery, refuses at this point to send people away by looking at his own poverty. This attitude alone makes the following miracle possible. During the time of liberal biblical interpretation, one has tried to interpret the story of the miraculous multiplication of the loaves of bread in a relatively practical way. And just by the way, this is how it is often preached on and interpreted about even today. This is the way it is interpreted in this practical way. I continue reading. To justify this, one has rightly referred to many things that Jesus actually said and did. The story of the multiplication of the loaves of bread seemed to contain a call that we should abandon the narrow-mindedness of our selfishness and instead learn to share our possessions with others. Undoubtedly, this is a correct and wise idea. If each of us gave even a little of what we have in excess as a gift to those who absolutely need it, there would be much less starvation, suffering, coldness, and dying in this world. If we would only reflect on what we really need, in the sense of the so-called Lord's Prayer, our daily bread give us today, then there would be an entire handful of people at our side whom we could feed and clothe. Jesus most certainly thought this way. And this way of thinking fits undoubtedly in everything he wanted and embodied. Nevertheless, this appeal to compassion is only one part of the teaching of this story of the miraculous multiplication of the loaves of bread. First of all, the task at first is not to discover one's own excess. Conversely, the story begins quite decisively with the discovery of our utter poverty. It is not possible, and in itself quite inconceivable, to feed the 5,000 men with their wives and children from our own hands. Still, Jesus wants that precisely this miracle of the transformation of our poverty takes place. It is as if once again the days of the Exodus in the desert had begun once more, when Israel had escaped from the bondage of Egypt, and Moses did not know when the sun would be setting in the west in the evening, how in the morning he would get the people through the desert and through another day. But every morning began with Israel picking up manna from heaven, from the wet stones in the desert, and with living each day out of the hands of God without knowing how. This example certainly does not contain a practical teaching for how we can make a living, but it is a symbol for what really sustains us in life and from what we really exist. The Hebrew Bible contains another story of a miraculous multiplication of bread. The legend of the widow of Sarepta, who, on the verge of starvation, gave the prophet Elijah the rest of her flour and her oil as food. The little jar of the widow of Sarepta, tells the Hebrew Bible, much like the German legend of the faithful Eckhart, fairy tale, never again ceased giving flour and oil. The story is in 1 Kings chapter 17. The meaning of such stories is obvious. We humans could be so infinitely rich if we would fill our empty hands with the gifts of compassion. But beyond such an exhortation to humanity, the story of the miraculous multiplication of the loaves of bread contains something even more beautiful, in that it speaks above all of the reason for all of our humanity. On that night, Jesus himself holds nothing in his own hands to satisfy the multitudes. But he does something that we can do ourselves at any time. It is possible to ask the other, the one who is hungry herself or himself, to entrust and give us what she or he has. Certainly, she or he will say that it is not enough, perhaps not even for themselves, certainly not also for the other. They will be worried about the few possessions that seem too little, and then cling all the more to their own belongings. And yet, every real relationship among people is like such an opening up and such a giving of oneself to another in the field of poverty, which slowly matures into a deeper trust. The miracle of the multiplication of the loaves of bread near Jesus begins when we lift our eyes together from our poverty up to heaven. We have this wonderful ability to touch the life of others as a gift entrusted to us and to bless it with the grace of heaven. Or even more deeply, to discover it to be a blessing in which we find the grace of heaven. Such a miracle of transformation can take place when we accept from the heart everything the other person puts into our hands and give it back to him or her as a gift of blessing. Nothing is to be considered small or little if we see it with the eyes of God, who wants that we exist in our meagerness. Every human life can be transformed from its poverty into the richness of God, so that our heart becomes wide in the happiness from God's compassion. in such a miracle of transformation, nothing can actually be accounted or accounted for. And yet, in the end, even in the areas of what can be counted and is visible, perhaps everything can seem to be fundamentally richer, more beautiful, more fruitful, and more useful than before. One may, in the end, even create a statistic about the success of such a transformation. But how this richness of heart comes about can be grasped only on the basis of a transformation of our poverty into the blessing of heaven. Since that evening of the multiplication of the loaves of bread, this miracle has not ceased. Every communion celebration in the church consists in giving ourselves into God's hands in the knowledge that we do not possess anything, and that we lift up our eyes toward heaven to receive back our existence as a blessing. For the senses, the bread remains what it is. It does not at all change its shape. But under the appearance of the external, God enters our lives. And beyond the anxiety, beyond the narrowness, beyond the disaster of the beheading of John the Baptist that has just occurred, there begins a vastness of the heart that we have never known. We still live. We will live. And the power of death will be broken in the sign of the bread that multiplies as soon as we dare to give ourselves to each other. Here ends the interpretation of the first story. That there are two stories, maybe because this is one of the theories in exegesis, that one was told to Jewish Christians and another was told to non-Jewish Christians, the so-called heathens or pagans at the time. In the interpretation of the second miraculous multiplication of the loaves of bread, Drewermann zooms in on the image of giving gifts as the key to understand the story. He also reconnects with the Exodus story. The text for this story is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 1 to 10. In those days, when once again a large crowd was there and had nothing to eat, Jesus calls the disciples over and tells them, I feel for the people. The Greek word here is feeling compassionate. Because they have been staying with me already for 3 days and have nothing to eat. So if I were to let them go home hungry, they will faint on the way. Also, some of them have come a long way. Then his disciples answered him, from where can anyone here get enough bread in this deserted place to satisfy all of these people? Then he asked them, how many loaves of bread do you have? They said, 7. Then he instructs the people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves of bread, gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to present them to the people. And they did so. They also had a few small fish. He also gave thanks for those and presented them as well. And they ate and were satisfied. And they carried away 7 baskets full of broken pieces. But there were about 4,000 people. Only then he dismissed them. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha. This second interpretation is a bit shorter than the first. And here is Drewermann's interpretation. What do we have to give each other? If we look at the need all around, it will never be enough. Again and again, we experience this. Somewhere on the street, on the train, in a cafe. If we try to listen to another person for just a moment, it will gush forth in them as if a wellspring of pain and suffering has just waited to break free under dried, rocky ground, and as if they had just looked for this moment of a possible conversation in which they could finally communicate themselves and pour out freely the overabundance of all that has been held back for far too long. This is the case everywhere. And the New Testament or the Christian scriptures are quite right when it emphasizes that without exception, we resembled humans who are like the sick, in search of healing, in need of redemption, filled with a longing for rescue. Indeed, the need of people is boundless. So what can we do? It is a feeling not unlike the hour of Israel's exodus through the desert. On the one hand, there is a tremendous urge toward freedom, space, and real life. It is an hour of beginning, of escape from Egypt, the land of bondage. On the other hand, there is a feeling as if a second Moses had to come to bring a new rain of manna over the desert, while we ourselves, anxious and in distress, do not know where to go. It is as if the misery of the people were so great that at the same time they needed a second Passover lamb, and that one would be eaten up, consumed, and used up by the need all around. This is how it often feels like in burnout. To continue, what can one do? If we respond to the challenges of our lives according to the way we have been taught to be adults, then we will certainly first try to delineate our competences of helplessness. We will do so by asking ourselves what abilities we have, what we have brought to the table, who we ourselves are, what we can do, and who among us is responsible when needed. We will try to offset need against performance, and soon we will realize that the balance comes to nothing. We are never sufficiently trained, sufficiently equipped, sufficiently able. If people's need is boundless, it seems that nothing can be done and that resignation will have the last word. At the same time, it also provides an excuse for us to pretend we can get around it, for any kind of inertia of the heart, meaning getting around doing something. In this miracle story in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus very intentionally asks his disciples, "How many loaves of bread do you have?" As if he wanted to highlight the complete absurdity of the situation, so that even the last one realizes that with the logic of, "What do I have?" nothing ever can be set in motion. What can one do with 7 loaves of bread and a few small fish in light of this boundless need? But everything that Jesus wants for us and from us is apparently this alone. We should learn to give up accounting and counting altogether, so that in the simplicity of trust and in the power of an immediate feeling of love and of connection with all need, we can simply give ourselves and to give the other freely what we have, however small it may be, and however little it may seem to us. If only we dare to use it, then this miracle will occur again and again in our lives, that our empty hands are able to convey to others a richness that we would never have thought possible before by looking at ourselves. So I just want to highlight the point here. The point is not to try to give more than we have, but instead to appreciate the little we have and to just give that. That will not lead to burnout. But if we all do that, then there is an abundance. So the miracle is not to create something out of nothing here, physically. The miracle is that when we do not minimize who we are and what we have, and instead see it for what it is, not as too little, not as too small, and trust that it will make a difference, trust that it will be acceptable, then the miracle happens of the multiplication that is being talked about in this story. To continue with Drewermann's interpretation, here we're coming close to the end. For example, if we asked some parents how they live in relation to their children, they would undoubtedly often say that they do not know the answer to many questions, that they are not the role models their children might need, that they are not the people who know how to lead and guide their life in a straightforward manner. And yet, it is enough that they are the way they are. Again and again, such miracles of transformation happen from a poverty that we sense all too clearly in ourselves to an enriching exchange with others around us. How else should we live together? So often we have to admit that we are not good enough, not smart enough, not beautiful enough, not lovable enough, not joyful enough. In short, in everything, not enough. And yet, if in spite of all objections, we try to give ourselves away, we will experience how the little that we are comes back to us multiplied, literally by the baskets, as an overflowing of the ring of a mutually confirming and multiplying exchange. In the end, the only concern that is really necessary is a certain care in dealing with what has been so richly returned to us, so that not too much of what has wonderfully and multiply come back to us does not go to waste, but that one handles it with care by gratefully breaking the bread of thanksgiving. There would be only one thing that we could do wrong, even in the experience of the miracle of our existence. And that is that one adopted the attitude to administer, to market, exploit what has become good by institutionalizing it, organizing it, systematizing it, ostensibly to shape it into something more and more effective. One will then inevitably experience that the mystery dies out and the miracle becomes empty. One can manage everything external, but nothing external really reaches people. We humans do not live by bread, but only by the love that dares to risk itself. Each one of us, by ourselves, on the mountains of their heart, is such a work of wonder from the hands of God, which when it enters into the space of trust, the space of love, is able to transform everything. Anxiety into confidence, poverty into wealth, need into satisfaction, sickness into healing, powerlessness into happiness, sadness into joy. Love transforms everything. After this miracle, Jesus retreats again for good reasons with his disciples across the shore to Dalmanutha, to the other side. If we wanted to translate the experiences in this miracle story into a prayer, we could do no better than in the words of Psalm 116, verses 1 to 9. This is Drewermann's own translation, and I translated it here also in an inclusive fashion, not in an exclusive fashion. The psalm reads, and this will be the ending of this interpretation: I love God, for God has heard the call of my supplications. For God has inclined an ear to me in the time of my cry. Ropes of death surrounded me. Fetters of the realm of the dead wrapped themselves around me. Fear and misery were all I found. Then I called God by name. "O God, save my life." Merciful is God and reliable. Our God is merciful. God protects the supposed fools. I was done for, and God rescued me. So calm down again, my heart. God has done good to you. You have snatched my soul from death, my eye from weeping, my foot from stumbling. So I may still walk in the face of God in the land of the living. This brings us to the end of today's lecture and of this lecture series on Drewermann's commentary on the Gospel of Mark. I have shared with you portions of Drewermann's interpretation of this Gospel from a psychological, depth psychological perspective and also existential perspective in light of the research. Thank you for joining me and others for these lectures. I hope that it became clear that with these methods, these stories can feel and be experienced as stories of healing and liberation for us today in our lives. If you have enjoyed these lectures or this lecture today, feel free to share them or listen to them again, as they contain a lot of new ideas to sit with and transform our lives from poverty to richness, from callousness to compassion, from self-loathing to self-love, from hate of others to love of others. They have the potential to not only change us personally, but as Drewermann shows in many of these interpretations, and a lot of that he does in the footnotes of the commentary. Sometimes I have shared these footnotes, but as Drewermann also has written in some of his other books, this kind of interpretation can also change the way we structure our human societies and relationships, also with the non-human world, by attending to each other with a horizon of infinity, of infinite value that comes in the religious spiritual language from heaven, to attend to the needs of all and to shine light of what seems little to us to make it something rich. Some of the books that Drewermann has written about how this affects our social situation are books like this one here, Deadly Progress. He wrote that in 1981, I believe. It is a book that warned more than 40 years ago about climate change and provides an analysis of how our human anxiety drives the greed, drives the excess of use of resources that is destroying much of non-human life and the planet. And Drewermann develops in this book, Deadly Progress, proposals for how we can change our mind, how we can shift our consciousness, our way of thinking, and really deep down into our dreams, effect that change so that we will let go of what we actually don't need. Another book he has is The Spiral of Anxiety, a book on understanding war, the fears that lead to war. Ultimately, wars are fought because there are deep-seated fears, feelings of shame. And we are going through these lectures at a time when the Ukraine war is raging in our days. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the Western response of threatening with more weapons. We are seeing the spiral of fear, the spiral of anxiety firsthand today. Drewermann argues in that book, The Spiral of Anxiety, that the Sermon on the Mount is written also for times like these. There's no point in escalating this conflict. The more we escalate this conflict, the more people will die. And we are having the specter of nuclear war in this war going on. Threats have been issued, and their nuclear weapons have been used in the past by the United States once. So it is not unrealistic that they could be used again. But what drives this is anxiety and the pushing down of anxiety. One wants to create more anxiety for the other. That is basically the principle of mutual deterrence. But in a hot conflict like this, we cannot play with this. So the appeal that I have based on Drewermann's work is that we stop this spiral of anxiety, and that especially churches, temples, mosques, synagogues, and other religious places, leaders, call for an end of this anxiety, ramp it down, and speak about a gospel like the one we have, that we do not need to fight things in the name of a scarcity principle. The scarcity principle, which is what we started out with, our lecture series, is that there will not be enough for us, or that everything is forbidden, as the voice of the serpent says in the Genesis 3 story. And that leads to a violent God image and to shame that we are not enough. The gospel says that even if we don't feel enough, in God's eyes, we are always enough. Humanity has to come to a point where we don't see the other as enemies, but where we can see all as part of the human family, that we can let each other live, let each other be different, that we can share the way we have heard the story today. So that requires, though, this deeper spiritual work. in that spirit, I wish that you continue to pay attention to when you feel less than, and to remind yourself of a story like this. Looking at your emptiness, looking at your poverty, looking at your I'm not enough, doesn't need to be something you have to judge, but actually focusing on what you actually are and what you actually have. And seeing it with the eyes of heaven, with the eyes of God, will open it up into a miracle. In that sense, I wish you well, be well, and I hope you will have it well.